Forget their fairy tales of holiness. The vow of celibacy? The most brazen lie in history, conceived to hide the rotten core. They preached purity to you, but behind the altar was animalistic debauchery, paid for by your own fears. The truth of the church isn't quiet prayer. It's the screams of their bastard children and the clink of coins they used to buy the right to sin. You were fed a myth while they wallowed in hypocrisy, turning your faith into their personal brothel. Forget the stained glass windows and the soaring choirs. I want you to imagine a village priest in the 12th century. Picture him on Sunday morning, his voice booming from the pulpit, condemning fornication and adultery, promising eternal damnation for anyone who succumbs to lust. See the fear in the eyes of his flock, the peasants who believe his every word. Now, follow him home. Not to a cold, empty cell, but to a warm cottage where a woman, his housekeeper, is waiting. A woman who shares his bed, mends his clothes, and is raising his children. This wasn't a rare secret. It was the norm. An open, festering sore that everyone saw but was forbidden to name. It was called the concubinatus, and it was the silent, sneering truth that mocked every sermon, every vow, every single prayer. This wasn't just a failure of willpower. It was a statement of contempt. They stood before their followers, draped in the authority of God, and demanded a purity they had no intention of practicing themselves. They built an entire moral framework for you, a cage of rules and fears, while they lived freely outside of it, indulging the most basic human impulses they branded as demonic in everyone else. This wasn't just hypocrisy. It was a form of spiritual tyranny, a psychological warfare waged on the common person. The message was clear. Our power allows us to live as men, while our doctrine forces you to live as less. But this disgusting ritual of the public sermon and the private sin wasn't just the whim of a few thousand lonely priests. It was the symptom of a disease that had infected the entire system of power to its very core, right up to the throne of St. Peter himself. So how did they not only get away with it, but turn this systemic hypocrisy into a machine for generating immense wealth and power? The answer is even filthier than you can imagine. To understand the depths of this depravity, you must first look into the eyes of the monsters who perfected it. They weren't hiding in the shadows. They were sitting on the papal throne, draped in gold and silk, calling themselves the Vicars of Christ. Forget the pious portraits. We need to talk about the House of Borgia, a name that should be spat from the mouth like poison. At its head was Rodrigo Borgia, who clawed his way to power and became Pope Alexander VI. This wasn't a holy man. He was a gangster, a pimp, a creature of insatiable appetites who bought the papacy and turned the Vatican into his personal brothel. Alexander didn't bother with the pretense of a housekeeper. He openly flaunted his mistresses and his children, chief among them the infamous Cesare and Lucrezia Borgia. He showered them with church lands, titles, and wealth plundered from the faithful. While demanding celibacy from his priests, he was orchestrating orgies within the apostolic palace that would make Caligula blush. History remembers his banquet of the chestnuts, a sordid affair where 50 prostitutes crawled naked among the candelabras, servicing cardinals and bishops in a contest judged by the Pope himself. Can you even imagine the stench of such hypocrisy? The leader of 1 billion souls, sworn to celibacy, presiding over a sexual circus fueled by church money. And his son, Cesare, was a predator carved from the same rotten wood. A cardinal by the age of 18, he was a known murderer and syphilitic brute who roamed the streets of Rome at night with his thugs, indulging his every violent and sexual whim. He was the enforcer of his father's corrupt regime, the bloody fist inside the velvet glove of papal authority. Together, this family of jackals represented the ultimate perversion of faith. They were not servants of God. They were parasites who had latched onto the host of the church and were draining it of any moral legitimacy, replacing Scripture with their own liturgy of greed, incest, and murder. But a few jackals acting in the shadows is one thing. What happens when they turn their personal sickness into the law of the land? What happens when the entire mechanism of power exists, not only to tolerate their perverse desires, but to monetize them for the benefit of the entire institution? That's where the real nightmare begins. How did they get away with it? They built a machine, a brilliant, soul-crushing engine designed to extract wealth from human weakness. The Church, under the guidance of monsters like the Borgias and their predecessors, realized that sin was not a problem to be solved, but a product to be sold. The vow of celibacy, which so many priests failed to keep, wasn't a spiritual crisis, it was a business opportunity, and the currency of that business was hypocrisy. The primary gear in this engine was a disgusting little thing called the collegium. It was, quite simply, a fornication tax. A priest couldn't marry. That would mean his property and his children could have legal claims, diverting wealth away from the church. But he could pay a fee, a tax, to his bishop. In exchange for that coin, the bishop would look the other way as the priest kept his concubine. The church had created a protection racket. It condemned the sin from the pulpit on Sunday, and then on Monday, its agents came around to collect their cut of the profits. It was institutionalized, shameless, and utterly brilliant in its cynicism. This engine ran on a simple, brutal logic: make the rules impossible to follow, and then sell a license to break them. It wasn't just about clerical concubines. The sale of indulgences was the same principle applied to the masses. Have you sinned? Are you terrified of burning in hell for all eternity? Don't worry. For a small fee, you can buy a piece of paper that will shorten your time in purgatory. The more you pay, the less you burn. They had monetized salvation itself. The entire system was geared towards making people feel guilty, terrified, and desperate, because a desperate man is a paying customer. They had built a perfect, self-sustaining engine of filth, where the sins of the clergy filled the bishop's coffers and the sins of the public paid for the construction of golden cathedrals. It was a closed loop of corruption, a spiritual Ponzi scheme with God as the brand name. But every machine, when pushed to its limit, either breaks down or explodes. And an explosion was coming. An event so vile, so brazen in its debauchery, it would make everything before it look like child's play. This was the day the mask finally came off. October 30th, 1501. The place, the papal palace in the Vatican. The host, Cesare Borgia, son of the Pope. It wasn't a secret meeting in a dark alley. It was a declaration, a statement shouted from the very heart of Christendom that the moral laws they imposed on the world meant nothing to them. This was the night of the infamous Banquet of the Chestnuts, a spectacle of depravity that marks the moment the rot became an open, roaring blaze. The official chronicler of the papacy, Johann Burchard, recorded the events with the cold, precise horror of a man documenting the end of the world. 50 prostitutes were brought into the palace. After the meal, the tables were cleared, and candelabras holding lit candles were placed on the floor. Chestnuts were scattered among them. Then the prostitutes, naked, were made to crawl on their hands and knees among the flames to pick them up, for the amusement of the Pope, his son, and the assembled cardinals. But that was just the appetizer. What followed was a contest. Burchard writes that prizes were offered, silken tunics, shoes, barrettes, and other things, for those who could perform the act most often with the courtesans. All of this happening within the sacred walls of the Vatican, presided over by the man who claimed to hold the keys to the kingdom of heaven. This wasn't a secret sin, confessed in shame. This was a public spectacle. It was the ultimate act of contempt, a deliberate desecration of their own holy office. It was a message to the world. We are your gods now. Your morality is for you, the sheep. We are the wolves, and we will do as we please. They had crossed the line. The pact with the devil was signed in blood and semen on the floor of the apostolic palace. There was no coming back from this. This act wasn't just a sin against their faith. It was a sin against the very idea of leadership, of responsibility, of decency. But all of this, the orgies, the taxes on sin, the public humiliation of their own sacred vows, was just a rehearsal for their final masterpiece of cruelty. What they did next wasn't just a crime. It was an abomination against humanity itself. The true climax of this story isn't a grand banquet of prostitutes. The deepest horror is always quieter, more personal. It's found in the whisper of a predator in a place of absolute trust. It's the moment the sacred is weaponized to violate the innocent. We must now turn our eyes from the public spectacle to the private terror of the confessional booth, the place where the Church's hypocrisy reached its most monstrous form. This was the practice of solicitation, and it was the ultimate vulture's feast. Imagine a young woman, devout and terrified of sin, entering the dark, cramped box of the confessional. She believes she is speaking to God's representative on earth. She kneels in humility, ready to unburden her soul of its smallest transgressions, seeking forgiveness and guidance. And in that moment of profound vulnerability, the priest on the other side of the screen doesn't offer absolution. He offers a proposition. He uses the intimate details of her confession, her fears, her desires, her weaknesses, as leverage. He twists the sacrament of penance into a tool of psychological manipulation and sexual coercion. He tells her that the path to salvation lies through his bed. This wasn't an isolated perversion. It was so rampant, so systemic, that the Spanish Inquisition had to create specific rules to deal with it, not to protect the victims, but to protect the reputation of the Church from scandal. The horror is almost incomprehensible. The one place a person was supposed to be safe, the one ritual that promised spiritual purification, was transformed into a predator's hunting ground. The shepherds had turned on their flock, devouring them in the very place they had come for sanctuary. And what of the victims? They were trapped in a cage of silence. Who would believe them? Who would they even tell? To accuse a priest was to accuse God himself. Their violation was erased, their voices swallowed by the same institution that had brutalized them. And when the carnage was over, when the sacrament had been defiled and a soul had been shattered, a terrible silence fell. But in that silence, a new horror was born. The lie. The desperate, pathetic attempt to bury the bodies, shuffle the guilty priests to another parish, and rewrite the story. But you cannot bury the truth. And the truth that crawled out of that mass grave of broken faith was even more monstrous than the massacre itself. Every monster fears the dawn, and the dawn was coming for them. The stench of rot rising from Rome, from its brothel-keeping popes, its sin-licensing taxes, and its predatory confessionals, had become so overpowering that it finally triggered an earthquake. It was called the Protestant Reformation. When Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to that church door in Wittenberg, it wasn't just a theological argument. It was a roar of disgust. It was a reckoning for centuries of institutionalized hypocrisy, a declaration that the engine of corruption had finally pushed humanity too far. The system of indulgences, that cynical cash for salvation scheme, was the spark that lit the flame. But the fuel was the widespread knowledge that the men demanding this money were themselves drowning in the very sins they claimed to forgive. The Reformation ripped Christendom apart, plunging Europe into a century of savage, bloody warfare. Millions died. But was it justice? Don't be naive. There was no real justice. The Borgias were long dead, their name a synonym for evil, but the institution that created them survived. The Church's response, the Counter-Reformation, was a masterclass in public relations and damage control. They didn't fundamentally change. They simply got better at hiding the rot. They clamped down, reinforced the dogma of clerical celibacy with even more fervor, and perfected the art of the cover-up. The pattern was set, baked into the institutional DNA. Protect the system at all costs. The reputation of the Church is more important than the suffering of any individual. The predator in priest's robes is less of a threat than the scandal that would expose him. This became the unspoken, unholy commandment. In the end, their Renaissance empire of filth crumbled, but their legacy? Their legacy is a poison that still seeps into the ground we walk on today. It is alive in every modern headline about abuse scandals and institutional cover-ups. They taught the world a lesson, not about piety, but about how absolute power, cloaked in divinity, can create a hypocrisy so profound it becomes a moral black hole. And if you think their time is over, if you think we've learned anything at all, you haven't been paying attention.